With this chat, we're going to start out by putting my Patreon for those interested right up in the chat. It's also in the bottom of the description for those interested. This is going to be going over just some of the stuff that has been kind of lingering on in Congress since the pretty much since the new session has started. And we're going to really go over the actual issues that have really go down into the matter of everything. And since it's really boiled over into some of the stuff on the Democratic side, where they tend to be a little bit miffed on what Pelosi's done, we're going to start delving into some of the issues. Since I believe in the absolute stuff on the free speech and only defending the United States and not defending any other country other than the United States, this is going to be simply from the aspect of what is really the meaning of what would be constitutional from what the Congress should be doing. Now, first of all, is we need to look at the first question of what's going on. Is it anti-Semitism to not support Israel? Now, frankly, when we look at what a country is, you will see that basically we have plenty of countries out there, and there's no reason not to support every one of them. I mean, there's no difference from one country to the next. I mean, what's the reason why we're not supporting Paraguay? I mean, there's no reason why Paraguay is not getting a bunch of support with the United States, yet they're a small country. I mean, they're probably, technically they might even be about the same size as Israel. I mean, what's the reason why they're not getting a bunch of support? When we look at this, if you look at some of the things like when we're talking about Jewish residents, we would actually have more Jewish residents in Argentina technically. How come we're not talking about supporting Argentina? What about when it comes down to it, is we actually have a decent sized population from the Philippines that are actually Jewish as well, and the reason why is because they left after the Spanish Inquisition. These are actually Jewish people that were actually going to be killed by the Spaniards that actually left Spain and went all the way out to the Philippines. And they actually took a very, very dangerous trek out there. And they did this for security, because they knew, at least out there, that they were not necessarily going to be judged. Even though the land was Catholic, they were not. They tended to be a lot more open in the way that they treated people. And you will actually see a lot of Jewish restaurants there today when you visit there in Taguig City. Then when you so why are we not supporting them? So what it boils down to is this is no different than any other country. Just because you've put on your thing that you're a Jewish state, this means nothing more than any other theocracy. That means that essentially based on that we should support every theocracy in the world. Well, that would mean that we would essentially be supporting things that are against the actual governing style that we are. We are not a theocracy. And that's essentially would be going just by not even viewing that we should not have entangling alliances, but we'd be going against essentially the idea of what we are. Number one, they are not a democratic republic, or I should say democratic representative republic. In fact, they are actually a parliamentary system. When we're talking about that, that means they're based off the British system instead, which means they actually came off of Britain and didn't change their government, meaning they have no relation to the United States when it comes down to their system. So when we're talking about it, they really have no relation to our style of government. Then it might be somewhat similar, but it's still completely different in a lot of different ways. And there's a reason why, because they came off of the British government. They weren't founded. They weren't set up in the 40s after World War II, but in fact set up after the Treaty of Versailles. So, assuming that it has something to do with the Holocaust is illegitimate. The Holocaust is completely different. What actually created it was essentially British anti-Semitism to ship the Eastern European Jews that were out in England in the poor areas such as Whitechapel down there, and kicking out the existing Palestinians that were taking up the area, and they shipped out Palestinians to this area that couldn't even establish their own water, and they put the Jews there in the fertile areas, and they basically created this country there, and that was basically a way to get rid of what they viewed as their Jewish problem, because they didn't want to deal with these people anymore. And that was what essentially their idea was. And it was, and the Treaty of Versailles overall was, in Germany, was basically meant to limit their ability to rise back up through limiting their governmental options. If you look at historically, they didn't have the option of capitalism. They had the option of a progressive, or I should say true capitalism. They had the option of progressivism, they had the option of socialism, and the option of communism. And the reason why Hitler went with socialism is because of that, is because of his options there. And when we look at what we see in Israel is they've essentially adopted a form of basically socialism, but gaining their funds through international lobbying, and this is what they've done. This was even noted by economist Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman tried to switch them over to capitalism, and with very minimal success to get many people to believe in it, because they'd rather have essentially their welfare state and basically have other people pay for it. Now, this essentially is going against everything that the U.S. believes in. Now, when we look at what they've also done is they've gone into our country and they've essentially lobbied for boycott, divest, and sanction legislation, which these are these groups that use their actual First Amendment rights to push for, to basically speak out their mind against what Israel has done in the region. And it's not really a partisan type of idea of these groups. They don't represent anything, but because Israel views it as an actual threat, they actually go to Congress and lobby with money, and they do this more on the idea on bills. You won't see them put as much money into the actual, when it comes to AIPAC, the American-Israeli Political Action Committee, I think it is, or I think it's listed as, but but it's what they do is they put money on bills, and they'll either do it to kill a bill or to support it. And from a foreign country, which is essentially what it is, because America really has no impact on it. They actually put America on there just to basically make it sound like it's American, but it really is nothing of the sort. It's basically how can we pull a lot of money out of the system, and they have us paying for their wall, they have us paying for a lot of their stuff. And when it comes down to it, is they're basically essentially using it to aid their own agenda with this anti-BDS legislation, and they've done it through both houses of Congress, both the Senate and the House of Representatives. And essentially this is anti-constitutional because we're talking about free speech here. And they've essentially allowed it to pass through that. They've allowed it to go through in many states to where public workers cannot voice this, otherwise they will be immediately fired. Now when we look at that, is this essentially the act of just normal acts of Congress, and is somebody speaking up about this essentially anti-Semitic? Well, essentially speaking out about this would not be technically anti-Semitic. But in the same way is what it called someone voicing any opinion against someone who has an opinion against this. Technically, when it comes down to it, the attacks against someone who is stating something on this is not going to be considered as Islamophobic, just the same way. Just because they're making a statement does not mean you criticizing their statement does not make you Islamophobic. It doesn't, because you're criticizing the statement alone. This is another point that needs to be brought up, and it means other things for your statement, which I'll get to in a minute. But it does not mean that your statement is in itself Islamophobic. Just like the initial statements to criticize are not anti-Semitic, because frankly, it's no different than criticizing any other country that's trying to influence the actual government and any type of legislation to aid those countries. Be essentially the only country that you should be criticized that would be essentially not lawful to criticize, with the exception of criticizing on policy alone, would be essentially the actual nation itself, or going against the actual nation itself from these actual positions, or acting on, I should say, more acting on behalf of another nation. And that's what needs to be understood. But when we're talking about the idea of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, it doesn't exist when we're talking about the support of one nation or another nation. And especially when we're talking about the actual thing of like Ilhan Omar. Ilhan Omar is actually from a region that actually has is one of the Semitic languages as well. It's actually Southern Semitic, so referring to her as being anti-Semitic is actually laughable. But what ends up happening is they try to toss around the term of anti-Semitism for anything meaning against Jews. Well, that's not necessarily true. Anti-Semitism only refers to the speech of actually people against people themselves who are actually Semitic themselves. This means anybody within those Semitic language groups. And this could mean, and this is why the term Islamophobic is completely illegitimate. This is why, because unless we're talking about Islamic people out of those regions, we're talking about the actual Arabic people, who are actually within that region, or other Islamic people within those Semitic regions, we're talking that term is essentially illegitimate. Unless we're talking about Islamic people out of those regions, which most people can't tell if you're Islamic or not, and most people would go along with their business, with the exception of, I mean, there's very rare cases of people that have been dangerous outside of those regions, such as people that are converts to extremist cases of Sunni Islam from other areas, and converts that are out in areas of Central Asia and out in Southeast Asia as well, that have actually been problematic, but as well as the Chechen people. But beyond that is we're talking about that it boils down to this whole thing of what actually views of when it comes down to the term Islamophobia, the term is really kind of bogus, because most of those people, that when people would essentially term as Islamic, are actually Semitic as well. So the term should actually be anti-Semitism. But the fact is no one wants to use that term, because then they would have to use it properly, and that's where the problem comes in. No one wants to use that term of saying that someone who actually hates someone who is within that Semitic language area is anti-Semitic. They don't want to use those terms correctly. And if they were, then it would really dilute the actual argument. Essentially, someone who does not like a Palestinian is anti-Semitic. Well, essentially, this is what the argument could be put forth against a lot of these legislators who are going and legislating against Palestinians without actually understanding the actual history and understanding how the actual country of Israel was founded, and just basically making blind assertions of how you should make legislation based on what AIPAC wants, and that would be completely to call them anti-Semitic would actually be completely legitimate, even though they're being anti-Semitic out of being completely ignorant of the situation. It's still technically the proper term. Now, when we look at now we need to look at the third point, which is on the idea of treason. Now, this is not going to be essentially taken lightly, because when we look at treason, we're not going to look at it as actually trying to overthrow the actual government of the United States, but we're going to look at it in such a way that, are we actually finding a Congress that is actually showing loyalty to another country and trying to put forth their foreign policy goals above that of the United States. Now, the foreign policy goals have been set forth that we want to exit the region of Syria, exit the region of Afghanistan, most likely exit the region of Iraq as well, so that we do not put any people at risk, and we do not want to remove any of the leaders and cause any more problems. Now, when we look at this, is what does Israel want? Israel wants to remove Assad. and Israel has stated this. Israel has stated that they feel that Assad being allied with Iran makes him essentially a proxy, and then when it comes down to Iran, they'd rather have ISIS than Iran. Their actual actions show that basically they're going against the actual foreign policy goals of this country. Now, when we see the actual people in Congress that have actually put forth their support of actually Israel when it comes down to actually the goals on foreign policy and say we need to support Israel. Now, I've never seen any goals out there that say we need to support the United States. I've never seen this being stated once, and this is very, very disturbing. I've never seen anything that any people say we need to support the United States. Never seen this happen once. They always say we need to support Israel. Well, this would essentially be, and these people stating this should essentially be looking into as they're essentially committing treason because they're not showing loyalty to the United States. And this essentially is creating a situation for our actual country because they're essentially voicing support that's completely against the actual interests of the United States. They're essentially supporting essentially us to be a proxy military for not only Israel but also Israel's allies, UAE and Saudi Arabia, to essentially fight against Iran, who is not an enemy of the United States whatsoever. Iran does not represent any type of ability to attack us. If we're not in the region, they can pose no threat. And that's the whole point. And if you look at it, they're only a regional threat. So if we're not in the region, they can't pose a threat. Now when it comes to Saudi Arabia, they most definitely can pose a threat. And this is what needs to be understood, is that if we're in the idea of what can pose a threat, is we need to understand that there's people out there that essentially can pose a threat with this. Now it's going to be considered a major thing that's when it comes down to it is the goals should be essentially to assert the U.S. as what our goals should be is if we want to leave, we should be able to leave, and since there is no actual regional reason to be there, we should not have, number one, bases there because there is no actual regional goals, which means no bases are needed, and that there is no no bases there, there would be no reason to stay there. I know this is probably going to irritate people that state that this is what I'm stating, but the fact is it's true. When it comes down to it, is we should not be the military for these Middle Eastern countries such as Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. This is not our goal. It does not represent any goal of the United States. And I hate to tell people there, but that's actually the truth. And that's just the point. And we need to understand this and get to the point to where we are actually at to what needs to be the truth of what happens out there. And really, if you're going to do essentially what Trump stated, which was an American first policy, it needs to be essentially an American first policy. And this doesn't mean that we need to actually look at what really would be considered essentially treasonous out of what's coming out of Congress. And you need to essentially validate what is the goal of America, and really we shouldn't even be considering what is the goal of these other countries. And I think that when it comes down to it is that's kind of sick that we're actually doing this and looking out for other countries. Mind you, as I said before, that Israel is not and never has been any relation to the United States. When we look at what they've offered faulty intelligence and nothing else. They've never offered to even aid us when it comes down to when we've been attacked. They've essentially been a source of faulty intelligence, which means they've tried to drag us into wars to aid their own foreign policy objectives, which has always been to take out Iran, which is why they've been allied with the Sunnis, which, even though that's completely against their own self-interest, they still want it anyway, because they have this hatred of Iran, which is completely irrational, but we still would rather but they still would rather have that. Now, when it comes down to it, is we need to look at this thing realistically. Is there anything in the Middle East that's worthwhile for the U.S. to stay there? Well, we know that there's nothing worthwhile to stay there, and this is the whole point. And when we look at, and people in Congress know this, and they're showing actually support for people to say things for Israel and never say things pro-United States. They will let people actually state that we should be there in this region and allow people to state things and be pro Saudi Arabia and pro Israel, and essentially when it comes down to the actual representing the actual United States from a foreign policy perspective, none of them actually represent, none of them are out there, I shouldn't say none, but very, very few out there actually representing what the United States are actually looking for from an actual foreign policy perspective. And when we look at it, is nothing there represents our actual needs. When we look at the Middle East, there's nothing there, which means to be there would essentially be supporting these other countries as their proxy military. Well, that's not looking out for the United States as their as its own sovereign country. And when we do this, we're essentially just doing the bidding of other nations. And this is why when people vote for this and continue to do this and say that questioning such policies is basically anti-Semitism, to question the policies of us essentially being loyal to Israel, is complete nonsense. Because essentially when people are questioning the policies of being loyal to Israel or being loyal to Saudi Arabia, is complete and utter nonsense. Because the fact is we know that being loyal to these two countries is being complete and utterly backwards. And we need to understand that this doesn't make any sense. And when it comes down to it, is we need to listen to actual logic. Do we have any actual reason to be in the region? If there's no reason to be in the region, because there's no legitimate aspirations from this, then we leave. Which is why we should most likely leave. We should essentially shut down all of our bases and get out of the region. and basically say, you know what, if you want this area so bad, you deal with it for anybody else that wants to set up camp there, because frankly, it's a complete and utter nightmare. And we need to understand that the Middle East is not going to be solved overnight. We're not, nor is Central Asia. And we're not going to solve these things overnight, and to think so is a complete and utter joke. That's why we might as well just basically pack up and leave, because the fact is we're not going to solve it. These things were essentially because there's intervention that happened a while back. That have been essentially that essentially destroyed a lot of the region. And it has happened throughout the years. We essentially can't fix a lot of it, and this is the whole problem. And the idea of being loyal to another country is essentially the point of treason. Now, would this essentially be punishable? It's hard to say, because when we're talking about that, it's not essentially during a time, it would not be essentially with the country that we have war with, but it is essentially loyalty to another country, not to your own. And that is very, very questionable. And when we have this is very, very disturbing. And we need to start re-examining how we elect people into Congress and what we're doing. We can't elect people that have loyalties to another country than their own. And when we see this, we need to say, who do you actually have loyalty to? And we cannot elect people who have loyalty to another country. If they have any loyalties to another country, I'm sorry, but they need to go. And we're finding people that go, oh, I have loyalty to Israel. Well, sorry, buddy, you need to go. There's no relations between the United States and Israel that make any sense. Israel and the United States actually are not the same country. There's been no actual link between our two countries. When it comes down to it, is the only country out there that's actually independent, that actually has an actual link to the United States right now, is actually the Philippines. And that's because they used to be part of the United States. And if there's going to be anyone that we'd actually be tied to, it would be them. And if we look at their system, they have the same, their system is based on ours because they were part of us. And even when they redid their constitution in '87, we're talking that they did this in a manner that was essentially copying the same idea, just being a little more stiff and a little more direct. And that's what they did. And when we talk about it, that's essentially their ideas. So when we're talking about their system, that's their idea of, that would be who you want to be set up with. You don't want to be set up with a country that's basically socialist and a parliamentary system. That's essentially what you're doing. You're essentially basically setting yourself up to be linked with a country that's basically Great Britain-esque, and when it comes down to their governing style with it, they're no different than what they have with Maduro. The only difference is they're very, very imperialistic when it comes down to their military style, and they feel that they can essentially attack anyone because they have the backing of the United States. So when it comes down to it, they are not an ally. They're essentially abusing the system of an alliance with the United States, and they have been for a long time. And that's why when you have allies, you need to essentially re-examine if it's actually reasonable to be linked with these countries. Now, if we weren't in the region, their attitude would completely change, at least from a military perspective, because if we weren't in the region, they know that they would have to completely turn tail and stop doing this because they wouldn't have the United States to back them up. And it would be likely that if we weren't in the region, the Saudis and UAE would not be able to do much help for them either, because they would have to rely on their own defense, and that would be the case of the region. So what it would basically, if we were out of the region, it would likely create some type of a ceasefire within the area for the most part, because they wouldn't have the weaponry and refueling capabilities from us being out of the region. And when it comes down, and that's where something is very, very important, and this is why when it comes down to it, these aren't really allies. They're essentially just abusing our financial capabilities and our military capabilities for their own gain. And it's not what an ally does. Essentially, they're just basically seeing a huge amount of capital that they can steal. And that's not what an ally does. An ally is supposed to be reciprocated on both ends, and it's never happening, and it never will happen. This is why essentially we should break ties with all people in the region. Now that this would not be being Islamophobic, this would not be anti-Semitic, or any of these things or any of these things at all. It would essentially be looking out for our own foreign policy decisions, so we can actually make independent decisions. The same thing should happen with NATO. We should get out of NATO because NATO does not reciprocate either. If you looked after our attack on 9/11, none of them were actually there to defend us. Very, very few countries in NATO were actually willing to at least aid us to some degree, but they were very, very slow to do so when it comes down to actually defend us. I mean, but when it comes down to when they get attacked, they want us to come immediately and do these things, which shows that basically it's not about reciprocate. There is no reciprocation on these things. They want us to be essentially permanently planted there, but nothing. But there's nothing here for us to defend ourselves, and it's showing that basically it is one-sided. We're supposed to act as their military, or a portion of our military is supposed to act as their military, and we're supposed to fund the bulk of it, while they essentially do nothing, and they fund virtually nothing. Now the solution should be that we exit out of it because it's not reciprocated. Not that we make them fund more percentage of it. We should basically exit because it's not reciprocated. And this is the way you work with these things. It's not you're looking for a better deal. It's when things aren't being reciprocated, you leave. Because it shows that there is an actual case of not being wanted. I know this is getting off into a discussion on foreign policy, but when we're talking about this, foreign policy is a necessary decision in how we actually look at these goals and how you determine what decisions are being made. And when it comes down to these regions, and you're going to see eventually with these regions, is that we're not really going to be in any of these areas, because when it comes down to our actual goals, is our goals should just be to defend ourselves. And if you look at how often or how little we're attacked, it's almost never. All these cases are basically, let's defend all these other countries. And when are these cases reciprocated? Never. The argument for going in these countries is always they try to bring up some emotional argument. Well, when we start to go back to facts, they can't survive. When we go with facts and reason, none of these cases can survive, because the fact is what's the actual reason for us being there? Well, there is none, because when we respect sovereignty and look from that aspect, we realize we shouldn't be there. And then when we respect the idea of when we look at the idea of if they're really interested in changing the government system, they would have overthrown the government themselves. We look from that aspect and we see that if they weren't willing to do it themselves, they would have done it a long time ago, and that's the case. So it really changes your idea of how these things go. And if we see no types of revolution out there, even without guns or anything, if we don't see any types of things of like even just protests and things just naturally occurring, then there is no reason to actually start to actually at least aid these people, because the fact is these are not legitimate cases of intervention. If you look in Venezuela, there's really, I mean, they're looking like they want to actually take over their own government. We don't have to intervene, but the backing behind Juan Guaido is not there. That's another case with it. Do we have to intervene? No. What's the reason for actually trying to name Juan Guaido president? Oh, because the United States wants him to be named as president. Because the fact is they believe as an interventionist person that it would be beneficial. This is repeating the same thing as the Shah in the 1950s, and just going back in history. And this is the thing with it, why intervention doesn't work. And when you do this, it just blows up. It will blow up in your face. Now, if we look at the actual stuff with foreign policy or foreign policy interests, would actually be to mind our own business. Now, if we mind our own business, we would see that Guaido would have no support, that likely it would be Maduro or some third candidate would win. Guaido would be laughed off the stage, and we would move on. The same thing when it comes down to supporting these other countries. If we just back off, get out of these regions, we would realize that the actual financial need for the United States would actually be reduced down to a fraction of what it is. I mean, we're currently spending over $700 billion a year on military. We could essentially, if we bring all those people home, set up bases here in the United States, which would raise our level of security, which is actually constitutional. If you look at the Constitution itself, you will see that, and you will basically see that basically we could reduce our military presence around the globe and raise it here at home, and that would probably reduce our actual expenditures to about 1/3 of what they are right now. Why? Because frankly we wouldn't need them. We wouldn't need excessive amounts of weaponry, such as planes, drones, and these other things, because we're only going over certain areas. We're going over Hawaii and the other islands, over the other Pacific islands that we control over there. We would go over Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands in that region, and then we would have the United States itself, and then obviously Guantanamo Bay. That would be all our controlling regions. Oh, and Alaska as well, up there in the north. Now, beyond that, we wouldn't have any regions to control, which would limit the actual need for actual planes and all these other military vehicles. They would be very, very limited in use. We wouldn't need anything such as the idea of some of these vehicles would be very, very limited in nature. A lot of them, because the fact is you wouldn't need a lot of them. A lot of things can be done with aerial vehicles to back off any invaders, and it would make the country very, very strong. We wouldn't need any other types of forms. We essentially could do things with this basic personnel. And this is where we get our system, and it would be a lot smarter than we currently run. and we don't, and that would essentially save us close to $500 billion a year, and that's what we're talking about, and that's acting in our own interest and our own foreign policy interest, and this would essentially still give us the most powerful military in the globe, but what it would do is it would have us only defend the actual country that we're meant to defend. We're not defending the whole globe, which is leaving us defenseless at home. This raises the level of bases here at home by a massive level. And you're going to see that essentially it changes the way we actually look at how we defend the United States. And I think that's very, very important. Now, when we're looking at these cases of, is this treason, I think this would boil down as treason, because for these other people defending Israel over the United States, because we're not seeing people defend the idea of, or at least what I call more than a few, defending the idea of sending our people home, because when it comes down to it, they're saying that, oh no, we can't do this. We have to have these people around the globe all the time. Well, that's essentially going against the foreign policy goals of defending the United States, and that's essentially what the actual goal should be, is only defending the United States and letting and supporting the idea of all nations are sovereign. And if we don't do that, essentially number one, we're ignoring the rights of these sovereign nations, and number two is we're basically stating that that the actual country that we live in is essentially unimportant, and the real importance boils down into these countries that no one lives, that none of these Americans live in, and the bulk of the Americans are essentially unimportant. And that's essentially what we're talking about is treason. It's essentially you're showing loyalty to all these other countries, but you're showing no loyalty to the actual country you're supposed to defend. And when it comes down to it, that's essentially what it is. Now, it's not necessarily that we're at war with these countries, but I think we can look in such a way that's that when we're in a situation where sovereignty needs to be protected, because of and especially because of the way that many countries will try to take advantage of your economic system and try to leech as much money out and get as much political influence, I think we can declare that it's essentially you're almost at war with almost any type of country around the globe to some degree. And it doesn't matter if you try to claim them as an ally or not. This is why you shouldn't have entangling alliances. And this is where we are at. And this is why the idea of just proclaiming a debate against something as anti-Semitism is really insane. And you can't do that. And you can't claim that you can't claim any type of protection against against criticism as for Islamophobia, just in the same way. But this is basically any time where you're basically defending another nation in Congress it should be viewed as treason. You shouldn't be saying that another nation needs essentially to be thought of as highly as the United States. And no, that doesn't exist. There is basically the United States and everyone else. And every other nation should be thought of as equal. It doesn't matter if we don't like the nation or not, or if we consider the nation an ally or not. I'm sorry, but when it comes to debate, there's the United States and everyone else. That's how you get to the thing. You're supposed to have loyalty to the United States. You're not supposed to have loyalty to any other country. and it doesn't matter who's tossing a bunch of money in at you for elections, or who's tossing a bunch of money at you for these bills to get passed that are unconstitutional. It boils down to one thing, which is, what are you actually doing for what are you doing to actually keep up the constitutionality of the nation? And essentially, if you're not holding up for free speech, if you're doing what's in the best interest of those other nations because free speech is getting in the way, then you're essentially, in my mind, you're essentially committing treason. Because of that if your actual oath to the Constitution is getting in the way of doing things in the best interest of some other nation, then you've essentially committed treason. And this is where people like Kevin McCarthy and some of the other ones like that are essentially guilty of this. Now, a lot of people aren't going to be happy with me stating this, but the fact is that's what the case is. It's not a case of committing treason for speaking negative against Israel. It's a case of treason for speaking positive for Israel, and it's not going to be, and those people are not going to be happy when that goes on. And it does anger a lot of people when I state that, because the fact is the only nation that should be viewed as in a positive light is the United States. If you want to state that you're angry about certain policies, fine, but essentially you cannot state that any nation is free from criticism. There's no nation on earth that's free from criticism out there. And you cannot state that there's something of anti-Semitism or any of these this other garbage. You can't state that with it just because they proclaim that they're a Jewish state or whatever type of garbage they try to use. I'm sorry with it, but there's things called, but you have loyalty to one country, and that's it. You have loyalty to the United States and nothing more. And you have to understand, these lawmakers need to understand that you don't have loyalty to anyone else. And if you can't have loyalty to that one country, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to basically leave, and maybe you should contemplate trying to get citizenship in that other country that you have loyalty to, because if you can't have loyalty to the United States, you should probably rethink about your goals as what you're doing in Congress, because loyalty should only exist for the country that you're representing, and that's it. If you're working as a representative, you should have loyalty to only two things. Number one is your district, and number two is your country. That's it. If you have any other loyalties, it should be to the actual oath that you took. It should be your oath first, then your country, then your actual district that you're representing. That's it. Nothing else matters when it comes down to it. There should be no other country that you show any oath or any loyalty to. If you do, then essentially you're on the level of committing treason, because it shows that you're going to be representing the wishes of that other country over your own, and you are essentially going to be putting aside the actual Constitution for what's in the best interest of that other country, and that's when you should be stepping aside. If you feel that that's the case with it, then you should step aside. You should renounce your citizenship, and you should move out to that other country and ask to join them as a citizen, because that's frankly what the case is here. Because we do have quite a few members that actually show loyalty to Israel over the actual United States, and if that's the case, if you're going to do that, then you frankly need to leave, because you're essentially being treasonous against the United States. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure to share us on social media. Make sure to check out my Patreon and donate whatever you can. For those seeing this later with it, it will be right down below. And I will see you guys later. Bye, everyone.